Chapter 7. The Earlier Frankish Kings and Their Organization of Gaul 561, by Charles Oman. The sons of Clovis, Theuderic conquers Thuringia, 531, Childebert and Clothar conquer Burgundy, 532, their war with the Visigoths, Theudebert invades Italy, Clothar reunites the Frankish kingdoms, 558, organization of the Frankish realm, the great officials, mayors of the palace, counts and dukes, local government, the malice, legal and financial arrangement. Clovis left 4 sons. 1. Theuderic, born to him by a Frankish wife in early youth. 3. Clodomir, Childebert and Clothar, the offspring of his Burgundian spouse, Crotecaldes. In accordance with the old Teutonic custom of heritage partition, the 4 young men divided among themselves their father's newly won realms, though the division threatened to wreck the Frankish power in its earliest youth. Theuderic, the eldest son, took the most compact and most Teutonic of the parts of Clodovis's realm, the old kingdom of the Ripuarian Franks along the Rhine bank from Köln as far south as Gaul, with the new Frankish settlements east of the Rhine in the valley of the Main. The sons of Clovis. He fixed his residence, however, not at Köln, the old Ripuarian capital, but in the more southerly town of Metz on the Moselle, an ancient Roman city, though one less hitherto famous than its greater neighbor Trier. In addition to Ripuaria, Theuderic took a half-share of the newly conquered Aquitaine, its eastern half from Clermont and Limoges to Albi. The Frankish kingdoms, 511. While Ripuaria was given to Theuderic, his brother Clothar obtained the other old Frankish realm, the ancient territory of the Salian Franks from the Scheldt mouth to the Somme, together with his father's first conquests from the Gallo-Romans in the valley of the Aisne. His capital was Soissons, the old stronghold of Syagrius, in the extreme southern angle of his realm. The remaining 2 brothers, Clodomir and Childebert, reigned respectively at Orleans and Paris, and ruled the lands on the Seine, Loire, and Garonne, which Clovis had won from Syagrius and Alaric. Their kingdoms must have been far less strong, because far less thickly settled by the Franks, than those of Theuderic and Clothar. Clodomir's dominion comprised the whole valley of the middle and lower Loire, and western Aquitaine, including Bordeaux and Toulouse. Childebert had a smaller share, the Seine Valley and the coasts of the Channel from the mouth of the Somme westward. The 4 brother kings were all worthy sons of their wicked father, daring, unscrupulous men of war, destitute of natural affection, cruel, lustful, and treacherous. But they were eminently suited to extend, by the same means that Clovis had used, the realms that he had left them. The times, too, were propitious, for during their lives was removed the single bar that hindered the progress of the Franks, the power of the strong Gothic realm that obeyed Theodoric the Great. Although the sons of Clovis not unfrequently plotted each other's deposition or murder, yet they generally turned their arms against external enemies, and even on occasion joined to aid each other. The object which each set before himself was the subjection of the nearest independent state. Theuderic therefore looked towards inner Germany and the kingdom of the Thuringians, on the Saale and Upper Weser. Childebert and Clodomir turned their attention towards their southern neighbors the Burgundians. Both these states were destined to fall before the sons of Clovis, but neither of them without a hardly fought struggle. Theuderic was distracted from his first attempts against Thuringia by a great piratical invasion of the lower Rhineland by predatory bands from Scandinavia, led by the Danish king Hygelac Crocolaicus, who is mainly remembered as the brother of that Beowulf, whom the earliest Anglo-Saxon epic celebrates, 515. Theuderic conquers Thuringia. The son of the king of the Ripuarians slew the pirate, and next year the Thuringian War began. It did not terminate when Theuderic, calling in the aid of his brother Clothar, utterly destroyed the Thuringian realm and made it tributary to himself. The Frank celebrated his victory first by an unsuccessful attempt to murder his brother and helper Clothar, who was fain to fly home in haste, and next by the treacherous murder of Hermanfrid, the vanquished Thuringian king, who had surrendered on promise of life. Theuderic led him in conversation around the walls of the city of Zulpich, and suddenly bade his servants push him over the rampart, so that his neck was broken. Southern Thuringia, the region on the Werra and Unstrut, was for the future a tributary province of the Franks. Northern Thuringia, between Elbe and Werra, was overrun by the Saxons, and never came under Theuderic's power. While the king of Ripuaria was warring in Germany, his younger brothers had assaulted Burgundy. In 523, Childebert and Clodomir attacked the unpopular King Sigismund, the slayer of his own son, as we have elsewhere related. They beat him in battle, took him prisoner, and threw him with his wife and son down a well. Frankish invasion of Burgundy. But Gondomar, brother of Sigismund, restored the fortune of war in the next year, and routed the Franks at Vaisserance, in a battle where Clodomir was slain, 524. Before pursuing the Burgundian War, the brothers of the dead man resolved to plunder his realm. The King of Orleans had only left infant children, so Childebert and Clothar found no difficulty in overrunning his lands on the Loire. The three young boys, to whom the realm should have fallen, were captured and brought before their uncles. Childebert, the ruffian who was of a milder mood, proposed to spare their lives, but Clothar actually dragged them away while they clung to his brother's knees, and cut the throats of the two eldest with his own hands. The youngest was snatched up and hidden by a faithful servant, and lived to become a monk, and leave his name to the monastery of Clodovold, St. Cloud. Of Clodomir's realm Childebert took the lands on the upper Loire, and the capital city Orleans, Clothar the Loiremouth and the part of Aquitaine south of it. Hearing a false report that his eldest brother, Theuderic, had fallen in battle with the Thuringians, Childebert now invaded East Aquitaine, a part of his brother's heritage. But Theuderic returned in wrath, and the king of Paris and Orleans resolved to go instead against the Visigoths, and to drive them from the land between the Cevennes and the Pyrenees. The great Theodoric was just dead, so no help from Italy could be expected by the Visigothic king Amalric, the grandson of the departed hero. Childebert found his pretext in the complaint that his sister Crotecaldes, the wife of Amalric, had been debarred from the exercise of the Catholic religion, and cruelly ill-treated by her Arian husband. With this holy plea as his casus belli, he marched against Narbonne, defeated Amalric in battle, and drove him over the Pyrenees to the gates of Barcelona. War with the Visigoths, 531. There he was slain, either by the sword of the pursuing Franks, or by the Visigothic army, enraged at the cowardice which he had displayed in the struggle. On his death, the Goths raised on the shield, and saluted as king the aged Count Theudes, the regent who had ruled Spain for Theodoric the Great during the minority of Amalric. Thus ended the race of the Baltings as rulers of the Visigoths. Their succeeding kings were not of the old royal house. Theudes, who was suspected of having had some hand in his late pupil's murder, soon justified the choice of the Goths, by recovering Narbonne and the other cities of Septimania from the Franks. Childebert had turned off to another quest, and the old Visigothic possessions north of the Pyrenees were retaken without much trouble, 531. The enterprise which had called away Childebert was a new attempt to conquer Burgundy, in which his brother Clothar had promised to join him. Burgundy conquered, 532. In the spring of 532, the kings of Paris and Soissons united their forces and marched up the valley of the Yonne. They laid siege to Autun, and when Gondomar the Burgundian monarch came to its relief, beat him with such decisive results that he fled into Italy and abandoned his kingdom. A few sieges put the victorious Frankish brethren in possession of the whole Burgundian realm as far as the borders of the Ostrogoths on the Alps and the Drôme. When Burgundy had been conquered, the Franks began to prepare for a new campaign against the Visigoths, in which Theuderic intended to share no less than his brothers. But this scheme was frustrated by the death of the king of Ripuaria early in the year 533. He left a son, Theudebert, already a grown man and a good warrior. But in true Merovingian fashion, the uncles of the heir made a vigorous attempt to seize and divide his realm. It was only the prompt and enthusiastic way in which the Ripuarians rallied around their young king that saved him from the fate of his cousins, the princes of Orleans. Not merely, however, did Theudebert hold his own, but he compelled his uncles to give him a share of the newly conquered Burgundy when the partition of that country was finally made. Theudebert was, in fact, well able to take care of himself, and soon showed that he was as unscrupulous and enterprising, if not quite so bloodthirsty, as his father and uncles. Yet he was, for a Meroving, not an unfavorable specimen of a monarch, and the chroniclers tell us that he ruled his kingdom with justice, venerated the clergy, built churches, and gave much alms to the poor. That as a politician he was shifty and treacherous was soon to be shown by his dealings with Italy. Theudebert invades Italy, 535. In 535, the Emperor Justinian, on the eve of his invasion of the Ostrogothic kingdom, bribed the three Frankish monarchs, by a gift of 50,000 solidi, to attack Italy from the rear. Uncles and nephew alike were ready to take the money and join in the plunder of the peninsula. But in the next year the Gothic king Witiges, eager to free himself from a second war, offered to cede Provence and Rhaetia to the Franks if they would make peace with him and grant him the aid of their arms. The three kings gladly agreed and lent him an auxiliary force of 10,000 men, who joined the Goths in recovering Milan. Theudebert and Childebert are said to have cheated Clothar of his third of the gains, the former having got the money, and the latter the land which Witiges made over. In 539, Witiges and Belisarius were locked in such deadly conflict that the Franks thought it a good opportunity to endeavor to invade Italy on their own behalf. Theudebert came over the Alps in person, with an army of 100,000 men, all footmen armed with lance and axe, save 300 nobles who rode around the king with shield and spear. First falling on his friends the Goths, then attacking the East Romans in turn, Theudebert drove across the north of Italy, sacking Genoa, and wasting all the valley of the Po as far as Venetia. All the open country was in his hands, and the Goths and Romans had to shut themselves up in their fortresses. But a disease brought on by foul living fell upon the Franks, and so thinned their ranks that Theudebert had to retire homeward, relinquishing all he had gained save the possession of the passes of the Cottian Alps. It was, however, with his Italian plunder, that he struck the first gold money which any barbarian king coined in his own name. Instead of placing the head of the emperor on his solidi, as had hitherto been the practice of Goth, Frank, and Burgundian, he represented his own image with shield and buckler, and the inscription Dominus Noster Theudebertus Victor, without any reference to Justinian as emperor or overlord. Some of the pieces make him assume the more startling title of Dominus Theudebertus Augustus, as if he had aimed at uniting Gaul and Italy and taking the style of Western emperor. And, strange as this design may appear, it receives some countenance from a chronicler who declares that, after his Italian conquests, Theudebert was so uplifted in spirit that he designed to march against Constantinople and make himself lord of the world, 539. When in the next year the faithless Theudebert planned another expedition to reconquer North Italy, and had the effrontery to offer his alliance once more to King Witiges, we need not marvel that the Ostrogoth refused to listen for a moment to the overture, and chose rather to open negotiation with his East Roman foes. The surrender of Ravenna and the triumph of Belisarius followed, and Theudebert found that, in invading the peninsula, he would have the emperor as his foe rather than the king of the Goths. He refrained for the time from following up his first successes, but it is strange to find that, when the Gothic cause had again triumphed in the hands of King Baduila, and North Italy was once more torn asunder between Roman and Teuton, the Frank did not take advantage of the renewed troubles to make a second expedition. Conquest of Bavaria. It is probable that in these years, 541–45, he was occupied in another conquest, that of the land between the Danube and the Noric Alps, which now bore the name of Bavaria. The German tribes in the ancient Noricum, who had been subject to Theodoric in the great days of the Gothic Empire, the remnant of the Rugians, Syri, Tersalingi, and Heruls, had lately formed themselves into a federation under the name of Bavarians, and had chosen a Duke Garibald as their prince. We have no details of Theudebert's wars against them, but merely know that by the end of his reign, he had made the Bavarians tributary to the Franks. Their conquest, in all probability, fills the unrecorded time between Theudebert's expedition to Italy and his death in 548. For some years at the end of this period, we know that he was sick and bedridden, so that it is fair to put the subjection of Bavaria somewhere about 543, 5 years before the death date of the Ripuarian king. Theudebert left his kingdom to his young son, Theudebald, a weak and sickly boy, whose accession, knowing the character of his great-uncles, we are surprised to hear was not troubled by any opposition. While Theudebert had been busied in Italy, the other two Frankish kings, Childebert and Clothar, though now they were both advanced in years, had made a second expedition against the Visigoths, and in 542 overran the Gothic province north of the Pyrenees, and then crossed into the valley of the Ebro. They took Pampeluna and advanced as far as Saragossa, to which they laid siege, but in front of that city they received a crushing defeat from Theudegisel, the general of the old Gothic king, Theudes, and were driven back into Gaul without retaining 1 foot of their conquests. Narbonne and the Mediterranean shore still remained an appendage of the Kingdom of Spain. A similar fate to that which attended the armies of his great-uncles in Spain was destined to befall the first expedition, which Theudebald of Ripuaria dispatched to Italy. The boy king was too young to head the army, but the eastern Frankish magnates who governed in his name had resolved to renew the enterprise of King Theudebert. Two dukes of Alemannian race, Buxelin and Clothar, who seem to have possessed the chief influence at the court of Metz, set out in 551, while King Baduila was engaged in his last desperate struggle with the East Romans and overran part of Venetia. Holding to the alliance of neither Roman nor Goth, they threatened to attack both, but Narses, when he marched into Italy from Illyria, left them alone and proceeded to assault King Baduila without paying attention to the northern invaders. Battle of Casilinum, 553. It was only in the next year, when Baduila and his successor Tea had both been slain, that the armies of the Franks broke up from their encampments in northern Italy and marched down to challenge the supremacy of the victorious Narses in the desolated peninsula. How they fared we have had to relate in the preceding chapter. Clothar and his division perished of want, or plague, in Apulia. Buxelin and the main body were defeated and exterminated by Narses at the Battle of Casilinum. By the end of 553, all the gains of the Franks in Italy were gone, and 0 Frankish corpses had been buried in Italian soil or left to the Italian vultures. Less than 2 years after the armies of his generals had been exterminated by Narses, the weakly Theudebald died, and, as he left no brother or uncle, the East Frankish realm was heirless. It fell by the choice of the Ripuarian folkmoot to Theudebald's great-uncle, the aged Clothar, king of Soissons, who thus became possessed of 3/4 of the Frankish Empire. As his brother, the still older Childebert, king of Paris, was childless, it was now certain that after 50 years of division the empire of Clotovch was about to be once more reunited, 555. Though verging on his 70th year, Clothar was still energetic enough to go forth to war. When the dominions of Theudebald passed into his hands, he took up the scheme which his brother Theuderic, now 20 years dead, had once entertained, of subduing all the nations of Inner Germany. Beyond the vassal Thuringians lay the independent Saxons, and against them Clothar led out, in 555, the full force of both the Ripuarian and the Salian Franks. The Saxons, on the other hand, induced many of the Thuringians to rise in rebellion and endeavor to shake off the Frankish yoke. The fortune of war was at first favorable to Clothar, who put down the Thuringian insurrection without much difficulty. But when, in the next year, he led his host into the unexplored woods and moors of Saxony, he suffered such a terrible defeat that he was fain to flee behind the Rhine and cover himself by the walls of Köln. The pursuing Saxons devastated the trans-Rhenane possessions of the Franks up to the gates of Deutz. They were not destined to become the vassals of their western neighbors for another 200 years. The news of Clothar's disaster in Germany and the false report of his death, which rumor added to the news, brought on trouble in Gaul. Cram, the eldest son of Clothar and Childebert of Paris, his aged brother, at once took arms to divide his kingdom, nor when the news came that he still lived did they desist from their attempt. They sent to stir up the Saxons and persisted in the war. But before they had actually crossed swords with Clothar, the old king of Paris died, and Cram, reduced to his own resources, was fain to throw himself on his father's mercy, 558. Clothar sole king, 558. Thus Clothar, by Childebert's death, gathered in the last independent fragment of his father's vast heritage, and reigned for 3 years, 558–561, over the realm of Clotovch, swelled by the conquests of Burgundy, Thuringia, Provence, and Bavaria, made since the division of the Frankish Empire. Clothar was the worst of his house. It will be remembered how his career had begun by the brutal murder of his nephews. It was destined to end by an even greater atrocity. His undutiful son, Cram, though pardoned in 558, rebelled again in 560, with the aid of the Bretons of Armorica. Clothar pursued, defeated, and caught the rebellious prince. Then he bound him, with his wife and his young sons, to pillars of a wooden house, and burnt them alive by firing the building. This shocking deed roused even the brutal Franks to horror, and it was noted as the judgment of heaven that the king died exactly a year after he had given his heir to the flames. The wicked old man's body, however, was buried in great state in the church of St. Medard, as though he had been the best of sovereigns, 561. His kingdom fell to his 4 sons, destined to a new division just 50 years after its first partition among the sons of Clovis. The realm of the Merovingians having now attained to its full growth, and assumed the shape which it was to keep till the fall of the dynasty, we may proceed to give the chief facts concerning its social and political organization. Despotic kingship of the Merovingians. Like all the other Teutonic states, which were erected on the ruins of the western provinces of the Roman Empire, it possessed a political constitution which had advanced very far beyond the simple state of things described in the Germania of Tacitus. The conquest of the Franks had resulted in the increase of the kingly power to a height which it had never reached in earlier days. As the permanent war chief, in a time when war was incessant, the king had gradually extended his power from supreme command in the field into supreme command in all things. He and his warband of sworn followers had borne the brunt of the fighting, and naturally reaped the greater part of the profit. The check exercised by popular assemblies on the royal power seems almost to have disappeared after the first days of the conquest. In the time of Clovis himself, we find some traces of them still remaining. Once or twice the army, in the capacity of public assembly of the manhood of all the Franks, seems to assert itself against the king, but even this check gradually disappeared. The Frankish Empire grew too broad for any public folkmood of the nation to be able to meet, and the king only took counsel of such magnates, high officers of the household, bishops, and provincial governors, as he chose to summon to his presence. Two additional factors gave increased strength to the monarch. The first was the high respect paid to the supreme power by the conquered Gallic provincials, men long habituated to the despotic government of Rome, a respect far greater than any that the Franks had been accustomed to give their kings. The habit of obedience of the Gallo-Roman was soon copied by the Frank. The second factor was the enriching of the king by the vast extent of the old imperial domain land in Gaul, which was transferred at the conquest to the Frankish king, and became his private property, placing a vast store both of land and money at his disposal. The Merovingians, then, were despotic rulers, little controlled by any constitutional checks, and only liable to be deposed by their subjects if their conduct became absolutely unbearable. Their worst danger was always from their ambitious relatives, not from their people. The Frankish king was distinguished from his followers by the regal privilege of wearing long hair. To shear a king's head was the best token of deposing him, by his royal diadem and kingly spear. Occasionally he borrowed trappings from the Romans, as when, for example, Clovis was invested with the robes of patrician after his Gothic war. But the national dress was generally adhered to. The government of the realm was managed by two groups of ministers, the royal household, or palladium, and the provincial governors. The royal household. The household followed the person of the king in all his movements. It was mainly composed of personal companions, bound by the oath of fidelity, the comites of earlier days, who had once formed the king's warband, but now constituted his ministers and officials. These personal adherents were called by the Franks Etruscans. We have already seen that the Goths called the same class Saiyans, and the English Jesuits. The chief of the royal household, or palladium, was the official whom later generations usually called the major palatii, or mayor of the palace. He was the king's first servant, charged with the overseeing of the rest of the household officials, and ready to act at need as the king's other self in matters of war, justice, or administration. In the days of the first warlike Frankish kings, the mayor of the palace was kept in his place by the activity of his master, and was no more than an important official. But as the Merovingians decayed in personal vigor, their mayors grew more and more important, till at last we shall see them taking the place of regent and practical substitute for the king. The old English monarchies had no officials who can be compared in importance to them, but under the Anglo-Normans, the position of the justiciar was much like that occupied by the Frankish major palatii. After the mayor of the palace, the chief ministers of the royal household were the marshal cum stabuli, charged with the oversight of the royal stables, the cum palatii, who acted as legal advisor and assessor to the king, the treasurer, and the referendarius or royal secretary. Though primarily household officials, all these are occasionally found detached from the court on external business, commanding armies or sent on embassies. At first all the posts were given to Franks, save that of the referendarius, to fill which it would have been hard to find an educated man of Teutonic blood. But by the end of the 6th century, men of Gallo-Roman origin were occasionally found in occupation of them, and in the 7th century this became quite common. In 605, we find even the office of major palatiae, the most important of them all, in the hands of the Gallo-Roman Protadius. The provincial, as distinguished from the central, government of the Frankish realm was exercised by officers who bore the names of count and duke, comes, dux, graf, herzog. The whole realm was divided into countships. In the purely Teutonic half, the unit was the old tribal district, which the Roman called pagus and the Frank Gau, the counts and dukes. A count was appointed to each of these tribal units. In the Romano-Gallic half of the kingdom, the countship was composed of the civitas, or city with its dependent district, which had survived from the times of the Western Empire and often represented the original Celtic tribe. The count was both a military and civil official. He administered justice, led the armed levy of his district, and saw to the raising of taxes. Several countships were often united and placed under a single official of higher rank, the dux, which the counts had to follow and obey. These unions of countships were most common on the frontier, where a strong and united defense against foreign enemies would be needed, and where it would have been unsafe to leave the charge of the border to half a dozen counts, who might or might not cooperate willingly with each other. In Provence and Burgundy, the dux was also known by the Roman title of patrician. The provincial, no less than the household officials of the Frankish kings, were originally all of Teutonic birth. But, in the 6th century, Gallo-Romans are found entrusted with both the lesser and the greater charges. We shall have to make mention of one of these native dukes, the Burgundian Unius Mummalus, more than once, when recounting the history of the last years of the 6th century. Local government. The provincial governor, count or duke, was assisted by a deputy, or vicarius, whom he nominated to fill his place during his absence at the court or the wars, or while he was engaged in some specially absorbing task at home. The minor administration of the countship was carried out by centenarii, or hundredmen, called also on occasion tribuni. The countship was divided into hundreds, and over each of these there presided a hundredman, who was appointed by the count to act as a police magistrate in time of peace, and to head the men of his district in time of war. Petty law cases came before him, but at stated periods, the count went round all the hundreds in his countship, and administered justice at a public assembly of the inhabitants. The count's tribunal was called the malus. He sat in company with a few assessors, chosen from the chief men of the district. These magnates were called Rachimburgi or boni homines. They were summoned by the count, and had no authority independent of his, but by ancient custom, both Roman and Teutonic, assessors had always been called in to aid the chief judge. The system is found alike at the tribunal of the Roman provincial magistrate presiding in his conventus, and in the primitive German law courts described by Tacitus. The count, sitting in his malus, had full power of life and death, and authority in all cases, save where the persons concerned were so great that the case might be called before the king's high court, and tried by the king himself and the comes palatinus. The Franks not unfrequently enforced the death penalty for murder, arson, brigandage, and other great crimes. But they used also the system of wehrgeld, like our own Anglo-Saxon forefathers. With the consent of the family of the victim, almost every murder could be condoned on the payment of sums varying fro gold solidi for a slave to 1800 for a freeman of high rank. Wehrgeld. In cases when the proof of a crime was difficult on the evidence produced, the Franks often made use of oaths and compurgations. The accused for himself, or a body of his supporters in his behalf, made a solemn oath that he was innocent, and this sufficed to acquit him if no further evidence was produced. Judicial combats were also not unfrequent. They appear among the Burgundians, however, before they were taken up by the Franks, nor was the custom unknown of submitting criminals whose conviction was difficult to the ordeal. That by boiling water, where the accused plunged his hand into a cauldron, was the one most frequently used. It will be noticed that there was no trace of popular government in this Frankish administration. The king chose the count, and the count the hundredman. The king was not controlled or checked by any popular assembly of the nation, nor the count or hundredman by any meeting of the people of his district. The king promulgated edicts and laws on his own responsibility, and similarly the count administered his countship without any thought of rendering account to anyone save the king. Such assemblies as took place were summoned to hear the decisions of king or count, not to debate upon them or recommend their modification. The ancient German freedom had disappeared, to give place to an autocracy as well-defined as that of the vanished Roman Empire. Besides dukes and counts, the king kept other officials in the provinces. These were the domestici who were charged with the control of the royal domainland throughout the kingdom. They were the king's private bailiffs for his own possessions, acting much as the procurators of the fiscus had once acted for the Roman emperors in the ancient provinces. There were other domestici in the palace, whose offices were also financial, and who must apparently have served as underlings to the high treasurer. The revenue of the Merovingians seems chiefly to have fallen under four heads. Revenue. The first was the profits of the royal domain, worked by the domestici. The second was the produce of custom dues, levied both on the land and the sea frontier of the empire. The third was the produce of fines and compositions in the law courts, of which 1/3 always went to the king. But the fourth, and most important, was the regular annual tribute of the countships. Each district was assessed in the king's books for a defined sum, and this the count had to raise and send in, on his own responsibility. It seems that at first only the Gallo-Roman districts were charged with tribute. Theudebert, the grandson of Clovis, we are told, first subjected the native Frankish districts to the impost, a grievance so deeply felt that, when he died, the Austrasians rose and slew Parthenius, the minister who had suggested to the king this method of increasing his revenue. From this short sketch of the constitution of the Frankish realm, it will be seen that its organization lay halfway between the almost purely Teutonic forms of the government of early England and the almost purely Roman methods employed by Theodoric the Great in Italy. This is what might have been expected. The Frankish kingdom was by no means a primitive Teutonic state, but it was far more so than the Ostrogothic realm in Italy.